I'm sorry, folks, it happened again. I'm just wrapping up. Please give me a moment so that I can take care of this client who is in desperate need of a good dressing down. I'm not sure if I can even help you because all you ever talk about is money, 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 money. You even said that you dream of money bags. I know some people say you got to have it, but yet you seem to be completely oblivious to your real problem. You say that this man Antonio hates you because you're Jewish. Then how come he doesn't hate your daughter Jessica or your friend Tubal? But more importantly, you said that you hate him because he's a Christian. Does your daughter hate Christians? She's run off and married one. And answer me this once and for all. Do you miss Jessica more than you miss the ducats she took with her when she eloped? She's your own flesh and blood, for crying out loud. And what about this bond of yours? Do you understand that for a small piece of paper, it carries a lot of weight? Specifically in this case, a pound of flesh. I mean, I've heard that money can drive some people out of their mind, but I implore you, don't sell your soul for money, that mean green. So mark me well, Shylock, for I've never been more serious in my life. It's not just your love of money, but your hatred of Antonio and Christians that are for you the root of all evil. Just as in Herman Melville's Moby Dick, Captain Ahab becomes completely consumed with revenge. In The Merchant of Venice, we'll see the same thing happen to Shylock. So let's look at the plot summary. Bassanio, a young Venetian of noble rank, wishes to woo the beautiful and wealthy heiress Portia of Belmont in the northern part of Italy. Having squandered his own estate, he needs 3,000 ducats to cover his initial expenditures as a suitor. Bassanio approaches his loyal friend Antonio, who is a wealthy merchant of Venice, and has previously bailed him out many times over. Antonio agrees to help his friend, but his cash flow is currently low because his ships and merchandise are all at sea. Still, he promises to cover the bond if Bassanio can find a moneylender, so Bassanio turns to a Jewish moneylender named Shylock, and Antonio offers to be the loan's guarantor. Antonio has repeatedly antagonized Shylock through his outspoken criticism of his usury, that is, charging high rates of interest. In addition, Antonio has lent people money without interest, forcing Shylock to charge lower prices and lose more money. Shylock is at first reluctant to grant the loan and cites the abuses he has suffered at Antonio's hand. Finally, he agrees to lend the sum to Bassanio without any interest upon one condition. If Antonio is unable to repay the loan by the specified date, Shylock may take a pound of Antonio's flesh. Bassanio does not want Antonio to accept this risky condition, but Antonio sees the moneylender's offer as generous since it requires no interest on the loan, and he signs the contract. As Bassanio gets ready to leave for Belmont, his friend Graziano asks to accompany him. Graziano is a likable young man, but he is often overly talkative. Bassanio warns his friend to exercise self-control. Graziano agrees and the two leave for Belmont together. Meanwhile, in Belmont, the virtuous Portia is visited by many suitors because her father left a will stipulating that each must choose correctly from one of 3 caskets made of either gold, silver, or lead, respectively. Whoever picks the right casket wins Portia's hand in marriage. The first suitor, the Prince of Morocco, chooses the gold casket, interpreting its slogan, "Who chooseth me shall gain what many men desire," as referring to Portia. The second suitor, the conceited Prince of Aragon, chooses the silver casket, which proclaims, "Who chooseth me shall get as much as he deserves," and he believes he is very deserving of Portia. Both suitors leave empty-handed, having rejected the lead casket because of the baseness of its material and the intimidating nature of its slogan, "Who chooseth me must give and hazard all he hath." Bassanio is the final suitor, and Portia wants him to succeed because, having met him before, she's already secretly in love with him. He chooses the lead casket and wins Portia's hand. Still, he allows Portia the freedom to choose him or not, demonstrating that he truly does love her. She gratefully professes her mutual love for Bassanio. Meanwhile, back in Venice, Antonio learns that all of his ships are reportedly lost at sea, so he cannot repay the bond. Shylock has become even more determined to exact revenge from Christians because his only daughter Jessica has eloped with the Christian Lorenzo and is also converted. She's also taken a substantial amount of Shylock's riches along with her. In anger, Shylock takes Antonio to court. Back in Belmont, Bassanio learns that Antonio was unable to repay Shylock's loan. Portia and Bassanio marry, and so do Gratiano and Portia's gentlewoman Nerissa. Bassanio and Gratiano leave for Venice with enough money from Portia to save Antonio's life by repaying Shylock many times over. Unbeknown to Bassanio and Gratiano, Portia seeks the counsel of her cousin Bellario, a very knowledgeable lawyer in Padua. The pinnacle of the play is set in the court of the Duke of Venice. Shylock refuses Bassanio's offer of 6,000 ducats twice and then even thrice the amount of the loan, and demands a pound of flesh from Antonio. The Duke, wishing to save Antonio's life, refers the case to a visitor. He identifies himself as Balthazar, a young male doctor of the law, who bears a letter of recommendation to the Duke from the learned lawyer Bellario. The doctor is actually Portia in disguise, and the law clerk who accompanies her is really Nerissa. Both of them are disguised as men. As Balthazar, Portia delivers a moving speech repeatedly asking Shylock to show mercy. However, Shylock adamantly refuses any compensation and insists on the pound of flesh. But as the court grants Shylock his bond and Antonio prepares for Shylock's knife, Portia cleverly paints Shylock into a corner by being a stickler about the wording of the agreement. She points out that the contract specifically allows Shylock to remove only the flesh and not the blood of Antonio. Thus, if Shylock sheds any drop of Antonio's blood, his lands and goods will be forfeited under Venetian laws. She also tells him that he must cut precisely 1 pound of flesh, no more, no less, saying that, "If the scale do turn, but in the estimation of a hair, thou diest and all thy goods are confiscate." Defeated, Shylock agrees to take Bassanio's last offer of money for the defaulted bond. He wants thrice the offered amount of the bond, but Portia rebuffs Shylock because he had already turned it down. He then says that he will accept merely the principal, but Portia also prevents him from doing this, saying that he's already refused it in open court. Furthermore, she cites another law under which Shylock, as a Jew and therefore an alien, having attempted to take the life of a citizen of Venice, has forfeited his property, half to the government and half to Antonio, leaving his life at the mercy of the Duke. The Duke, however, spares Shylock's life and says that he may remit the forfeiture. Portia says the Duke may waive the state share, but not Antonio's. Antonio says he's content that the state waive its claim to half Shylock's wealth if he can have his half upon Shylock's death, when it will be given to Lorenzo and Jessica. Antonio also asks that Shylock convert to Christianity and bequeaths his entire estate to Lorenzo and Jessica. The Duke threatens to rescind his pardon for Shylock's life unless he accepts those terms. Shylock, threatened with the prospect of death, accepts. Bassanio does not recognize his disguised wife, but offers to give a reward to the supposed lawyer. First she declines, but after he insists, Portia requests his ring and Antonio's gloves. Antonio gladly gives his gloves without a second thought, but Bassanio gives the ring only after much persuasion from Antonio, even though he promised Portia never to lose, sell, or give it away. Nerissa, still disguised as the lawyer's clerk, also succeeds in getting her husband's ring from Gratiano, who does not recognize that the clerk is in fact his wife. At Belmont, Portia and Nerissa taunt and pretend to accuse their husbands of giving away their rings to women, which they unknowingly did, before revealing that they were actually the lawyer and his clerk in disguise. After these couples make amends, Antonio learns from Portia that 3 of his ships have not been wrecked and have all returned safely. When we come back, we'll look more closely at the remarkable characters in The Merchant of Venice. All right, so now let's take a look at some of the major characters in The Merchant of Venice. Up front, we have Antonio, a wealthy merchant of Venice who is also a Christian and a good friend to Bassanio. Bassanio is Antonio's younger friend who has repeatedly wasted all of his own money and money lent to him by Antonio as well. Antonio acts as a father figure to Bassanio, educating him, mentoring him, and encouraging him along the way. Bassanio is also madly in love with Portia. Gratiano is a close friend of Bassanio who falls in love with Portia's lady-in-waiting, Nerissa. Portia is a wealthy heiress in Belmont who is not free to select who she wishes to wed, but is secretly in love with Bassanio. Nerissa, Portia's sensible lady-in-waiting and confidant, marries Bassanio's close friend, Gratiano. Shylock is a wealthy Jewish moneylender who resents Antonio because he's a Christian and because he drives down the rate of interest. Jessica, Shylock's only daughter, elopes with Lorenzo, who is a Christian. The Duke of Venice presides over the court proceedings at the end of the play, but his hands are pretty much tied by the law. Balthazar is a young, learned doctor of the law who is actually Portia in disguise. And Balthazar's clerk is actually Nerissa in disguise. When we get back, let's take a look at the plot devices and memorable scenes from The Merchant of Venice. One thing you could say for Shakespeare is that he loved to use unusual premises and plot devices in his plays. The Merchant of Venice has 4. The first one is the pound of flesh bargain between Antonio and Shylock. Antonio actually calls Shylock gentle Jew because he doesn't even believe that Shylock would want a pound of his flesh. It's not really good for anything, except if you're out to exact revenge. Number 2, Portia's father's unusual conditions with the 3 caskets of gold, silver, and lead to determine who his daughter is going to marry. It sounds crazy, but actually as the play unfolds, we see the wisdom in his decision. It's also interesting to note that Portia says she's locked in one of the caskets and Jessica is locked in her father's house. So we see that theme played up in here as well. Number 3, Portia and Nerissa demanding their husbands' rings when they're in disguise just to mess with them. This is what wives sometimes do with their husbands. But to prove that love is blind, they say that their husbands gave the rings to women. The husbands say they gave it to a clerk and his boy. Actually, they gave them to women because it was Portia and Nerissa in disguise. But in Shakespeare's time, boys played the women's roles. He put a lot of responsibility on them in this play. So it just shows you how confusing things can be, especially in Shakespeare's comedies. And then number 4, Antonio's ships are believed to be wrecked at sea, and then miraculously they return undamaged. It just wouldn't be a Shakespeare play without a good shipwreck or 2. Now, as far as memorable scenes go, the most memorable scene in this play is the courtroom scene in Act 4, Scene 1. Notice that Shakespeare uses large gatherings at the end of his plays to bring all of the characters together and untangle all of the confusion and the various themes throughout the play. He also does this at the end of A Comedy of Errors, Cymbeline, Measure for Measure, Much Ado About Nothing, The Winter's Tale, and All's Well That Ends Well. Now, in these plays, the settings are usually in a courtroom or a gathering for the correction of law, but Shakespeare also does it to a lesser degree in the wedding scenes in As You Like It and Much Ado About Nothing. He does it at Diana's temple at Ephesus in Pericles, and in The Winter's Tale, he uses the unveiling of Hermione's statue. But regardless of the location, it's obvious that this plot device is used to bring about a happy ending and is consistently effective in all of these comedies. All right, now let's examine some of the motivations in The Merchant of Venice. We'll start off with generosity versus greed. In this play, we see how Antonio is willing to risk his own life in friendship to Bassanio to help him raise enough money so that Bassanio can win Portia, even though Bassanio has already borrowed and lost a great deal of Antonio's money in the past. We also see how generous Portia is to give some of her fortune to Bassanio to free Antonio from his bargain with Shylock. She's willing to give 27,000 ducats for his release instead of the 3,000 ducats that are due. By contrast, Shylock hates Antonio primarily because Antonio is generous and has loaned out money for 0 interest and cost Shylock 500,000 ducats of business. For this, he is willing to kill Antonio and considers his revenge just. Also, when Jessica steals away with some of Shylock's ducats and precious jewels to use for her dowry to Lorenzo, Shylock tells Tubal that he wishes his daughter was dead at his feet and the jewels in her ear. So you see, Shylock's hatred and greed are not limited to just Christians, but anyone who threatens his money, including his own flesh and blood. Thus is the love of money and Shylock's hatred truly at the root of all evil for him. We're going to move on to some more motivations that are probably the most common motivations in all plays, Shakespeare or otherwise, and these are love and hate. Shylock starts out early in the play saying that he hates Antonio because he's a Christian. He also repeatedly mocks Christians in the play and considers them to be fools. But Shakespeare doesn't demonstrate that his Christian characters hate all Jews. Jessica is described as beautiful and sweet by Lancelot. Lorenzo calls her pretty and wants to marry her and tells all of his guy friends, without any hesitation, "Beshrew me, but I love her heartily, for she is wise, fair, and true." Graziano asks Nerissa to cheer yon stranger and bid her welcome because she knows no one else in Belmont. Portia, who loves everyone who isn't one of her suitors, invites Lorenzo and Jessica to treat her home as their own while she's away. In addition, Antonio asks that Jessica and her husband Lorenzo receive Shylock's wealth as an inheritance after his death. We also meet Tubal, another Jewish character in this play, but he's a very neutral character. It's hard to tell where he stands, but he doesn't seem to hold the same outward animosity towards Christians, nor do we see him receive the same feelings of resentment from them that Shylock does. In fact, in Act 4, Scene 1, we hear Shylock say, "I have a daughter. Would any of the stock of Barabbas had been her husband rather than a Christian?" Now, this is a very important point. There is a major correlation in this play between how vengeful and hateful Shylock is to Antonio, the sacrificial lamb, when he feels that he can finally get his revenge on him, and the description in the Bible of the Jews insisting that Pontius Pilate have Christ crucified. A lot of this takes place in St. Matthew in chapter 27. Verses 15 to 18 we read, "Now upon the solemn day the governor was accustomed to release to the people one prisoner, whom they would. And he had then a notorious prisoner that was called Barabbas. They therefore, being gathered together, Pilate said, Whom will you that I released to you, Barabbas or Jesus that is called the Christ? But the chief priests and ancients persuaded the people that they should ask Barabbas. and make Jesus away. And the governor answering said to them, Whether will you of the two of these be released unto you? But they said, Barabbas. St. Matthew continues in chapter 27, now starting again in verse 24. And Pilate, seeing that he had prevailed nothing, but that rather a tumult was made, taking water, washed his hands before the people, saying, I am innocent of the blood of this just man. Look you to it. And the whole people answering said, His blood be upon us and upon our children. Then he released them, Barabbas, having scourged Jesus, delivering him unto them to be crucified. Now, similarly, in Act 4, Scene 1, Portia, at the end of the quality of mercy speech, says that she did this to mitigate the justice of his bond. But likewise, he answers, as the Jews answered Pontius Pilate, My deeds upon my head. What Shylock means is that he is so confident that he is not doing anything unlawful, that he is willing to suffer damnation if he is wrong. Shakespeare's audience would be well familiar with these references to Barabbas, who is certainly considered the lowest of the low. Shakespeare is making a statement that not all Jews are consumed with hatred and revenge. Certainly Jessica and Tubal aren't. Jessica even says in Act 2, Scene 3, What heinous sin is it in me to be ashamed to be my father's child? Though I am a daughter to his blood, I am not to his manners. O Lorenzo, if thou keep promise, I shall end this strife and become a Christian and thy loving wife. There's also one more biblical reference I want to point out. In the Garden of Gethsemane, before the day of crucifixion, Christ says to St. Peter, Put up thy sword, for he that lives by the sword shall die by it. You could easily substitute the words the sword for the law and see Shylock's motivations and his downfall. Shakespeare is specifically pointing the finger at Shylock and demonstrating how he is in a very rigid category, all his own, where he belongs. All right, now let's look at one more set of motivations in The Merchant of Venice. These are revenge, compassion, and mercy. We've already been exposed to the depths of Shylock's obsession with revenge. He's perfectly willing to kill Antonio for the love of money. But let's look deeper. We know that Antonio spit on him and called him dog. He doesn't deny it, but he never tries to kill Shylock. In fact, had the Duke not demonstrated his compassion and pardoned Shylock, it's very likely that Antonio would have asked for mercy for him. As it is, he does ask Shylock to become a Christian. Now, while Shylock may not want this, remember that for centuries, Christian missionaries traveled the world, risking their lives, and were often martyred, hoping to bring Christianity to new lands in order to save unbaptized souls. Christians who made up virtually all of England in Shakespeare's day certainly would have seen this as a merciful act, done for the intention of saving the soul of Antonio's enemy. This is what compassion and the quality of mercy are all about. And now we come to one of the high points of the play, which is Portia's incredible speech on mercy in Act 4, Scene 1. When it comes to powerful lines in The Merchant of Venice, along with Shylock's famous, "If you prick us, do we not bleed" speech, Portia's quality of mercy speech is a masterpiece of poetry. In fact, one could almost believe that Shakespeare wrote The Merchant of Venice so that he could have a play in which to encapsulate this speech and use it as a showcase piece. So let's take a look at the speech and also its placement in the play. It takes place near the beginning of the courtroom scene in Act 4, Scene 1. When Portia finds out that Antonio has forfeited his bond, she says to Shylock, "Thou must show mercy." And he says, "On what compulsion must I do that?" And she replies with this incredible speech, "The quality of mercy is not strained. It droppeth as the gentle rain from heaven upon the place beneath. It is twice blessed. It blesseth him that gives and him that takes. 'Tis mightiest in the mightiest. It becomes the throned monarch better than his crown. His scepter doth show the force of temporal power, the attribute to awe and majesty, wherein doth sit the dread and fear of kings. But mercy is above the sceptred sway. It is enthroned in the hearts of kings. It is an attribute to God himself. And earthly power doth then show likest God's, when mercy seasons justice. Therefore, Jew, though justice be thy plea, consider this, that in the course of justice none of us should see salvation. We do pray for mercy, and that same prayer does teach us all to render the deeds of mercy. All right, let's look at some of the major turning points and correlations in The Merchant of Venice. We start off in Act 3, Scene 2. Bassanio chooses the right casket, which is base-led, which wins Portia as his wife. Thus, he frees Portia like Lorenzo has freed Jessica. Also in Act 3, Scene 2, Portia gives Bassanio her ring, the symbol of fidelity and eternity, which is going to be an important plot device later on in the play. By the way, the ring trick, as it's known, is also used in Cymbeline and All's Well That Ends Well. And now let's go to Act 3, Scene 1. Shylock tells Soliano and Salerio why he wants a pound of flesh for revenge. This is, "If you prick us, do we not bleed," the most famous speech in the entire play. But let's look into the setup. They know that Antonia has forfeited. Why would Shylock want to take a pound of his flesh? And Salerio says, "Why, I'm sure if he forfeit, thou wilt not take his flesh. What's that good for?" And we hear his reply, which starts out almost sympathetic, but later shows the depths of his hatred. "To bait fish withal. If it will feed nothing else, it will feed my revenge. He hath disgraced me and hindered me 500,000, laughed at my losses, mocked at my gains, scorned my nation, thwarted my bargains, cooled my friends, hated mine enemies. And what's his reason? I am a Jew. Hath not a Jew eyes? Hath not a Jew hands, organs, dimensions, senses, affections, passions, fed with the same food, hurt with the same weapons, subject to the same diseases, healed by the same means, warmed and cooled by the same winter and summer as a Christian? If you prick us, do we not bleed? If you tickle us, do we not laugh? If you poison us, do we not die? And if you wrong us, shall we not revenge? If we are like you in the rest, we will resemble you in that. If a Jew wrong a Christian, what is his humility? Revenge. If a Christian wrong a Jew, what should his sufferance be by Christian example? Why, revenge. The villainy you teach me, I will execute, and it shall go hard, but I will better the instruction." And let's finish up with Act 4, Scene 1, the biggest, most important scene of the play, when Portia tells Shylock that according to the law, he may not take one drop of blood from Antonio, thus thwarting his plans for revenge. Before we get into some of the interesting facts about The Merchant of Venice, I'd like to point out some other things of interest. First of all, Shakespeare is an incredible wordsmith, and he interchanges the words Gentile, which is non-Jewish, and gentle throughout the entire play to mean the same things. To his audience, they certainly would. We also hear the phrase, "All that glisters is not gold," which the Prince of Morocco reads when he opens the gold casket. We know that phrase better today as "all that glitters is not gold." Now you know its origin. Also, when Antonio asks if Shylock knows the terms of the bargain, he says, oh, that's right, 3 months. I had forgot. You told me so. Well, I can tell you as a business coach, a moneylender would never forget the amount to be borrowed, when it was due, and what the forfeit was. So, again, it is a comedy. It should be funny. I also want to mention that Portia, at the beginning of the courtroom scene, says, "Which is the merchant and which the Jew?" Well, as you're going to see in a moment, most of Shakespeare's audience had never seen a Jew. Therefore, on stage, most Jews were portrayed with red hair and a big, long, pointy nose. It would have been amusing to the audience then for her to ask that question. Many commentators love to thrust their own personal and political agendas into The Merchant of Venice, stating anti-Semitic motives. But consider this. Edward I expelled all Jews from England in 1290. They were not allowed to return again until 1656, 40 years after Shakespeare's death. Shakespeare wrote The Merchant of Venice between 1596 and 1598. At the time, there were virtually no Jews in England when Shakespeare wrote this play. Moreover, it's very likely that he had never met one in his entire life, nor had most of his audience. Shakespeare creates exotic characters like Othello, Shylock, and the Prince of Morocco that would be interesting to learn more about to theater goers in his almost entirely Christian country. Shakespeare's contemporary, Christopher Marlowe, wrote the play The Jew of Malta about 8 years before The Merchant of Venice. Now, in Marlowe's play, the Jew was named Barabbas, just like in the Bible. This character was completely evil and had no redeeming qualities. He poisons a slave, a prostitute, and a nunnery full of nuns, including his own daughter, strangles an old friar, frames another friar for that murder, and plots with the enemy Turks to besiege the city. By comparison, Shylock is a three-dimensional character who mourned the loss of his ex-wife and has specific reasons for his hatred, even if they are not shared by the audience. It's important for us to remember that Shakespeare was writing to give his stage actors magnificent roles and parts. He also wanted to enthrall theatergoers. Ask any actor worth his salt, and he will tell you that in order to be taken seriously, one must perform a major Shakespeare role and do it well. This has been the benchmark for acting talent for any serious thespian. Actors, including Sir John Gielgud, Peter O'Toole, Patrick Stewart, and Al Pacino, have all played Shylock. So let's applaud the playwright for giving all of his characters such richness of emotions and making them so memorable and timeless. There are three specific actors I want to call your attention to that appear in similar productions and other Shakespeare productions besides The Merchant of Venice. First is John Franklin Robbins, who plays Antonio in the 1980 BBC version of The Merchant of Venice. He'll also play Baptista in the BBC's version of The Taming of the Shrew that same year. And he also plays Mr. Cole in the 1996 version of Emma with Gwyneth Paltrow. Gemma Jones, who plays Portia in the 1980 BBC version of The Merchant of Venice, will also play Mrs. Dashwood in the 1996 version of Sense and Sensibility, with Emma Thompson and Kate Winslet playing her daughters and Elizabeth Spriggs playing Mrs. Jennings. By the way, Elizabeth Spriggs will also appear as Mistress Quickly in the 1979 version of Merry Wives of Windsor, and as Calpurnia in the 1982 BBC version of Julius Caesar. And finally, John Rhys Davies appears as Solario in The Merchant of Venice in the 1980 BBC version. He'll also appear as Caputius opposite Claire Bloom in the 1979 BBC production of Henry VIII. You'll probably recognize him from several different Indiana Jones movies and Lord of the Rings movies. And now, get set, because it's time for today's trivia contest. Do you even have a clue? I'll see you in just a moment. Today's trivia challenge is called, Do You Even Have a Clue? Like the board game. I'll tell you who was killed, where it happened, and what the murdered weapon was. Can you name the play and who done it? Number 1. Desdemona in her bedchamber with a pillow. Number 2, King Duncan in a Dunsinane Castle guest room with a dagger. Number 3, the Queen of Egypt in a monument with an asp. Give it your best shot and come on back for the answers. Okay, now let's see how you did with Do You Even Have a Clue? Number 1, who killed Desdemona in her bedchamber with a pillow? Of course, that was Othello, her husband, in Othello. Number 2, who killed King Duncan in a Dunsinane Castle guest room with a dagger? That was Macbeth in Macbeth. And number 3, the Queen of Egypt was killed in a monument with an asp by Cleopatra herself, who slew herself in Antony and Cleopatra. Now, let's look at some Merchant of Venice relevant lessons. First, don't get consumed with hatred, greed, or revenge against anyone or anything. The best revenge is living well and going to heaven when you die. Number 2, remember that success leaves clues. We hear at the beginning of the play a story that Bassanio tells Antonio. He says, in my school days, when I had lost one shaft or arrow, I shot a fellow of the selfsame flight the selfsame way, with more advised watch, to find the other fourth, and by adventuring both, I often found both. In other words, success leaves clues. If you want to be successful, watch and see what works so you can duplicate it going forward. Number 3, when Bassanio wins Portia after he picks the right casket, he just doesn't take her, even though he can, according to the conditions of the will. What he says instead is, fair lady, by your leave, I come by note to give and to receive, like one of two contending in a prize, that thinks he hath done well in people's eyes, hearing applause and universal shout, giddy in spirit, still gazing in a doubt, whether those peals of praise be his or no. So thrice, fair lady, stand I even so, as doubtful whether what I see be true, until confirmed, signed, ratified by you. What Bassanio is saying here is that when you love someone, make sure that you put their needs ahead of your own. And finally, in Act 1, Scene 1, we see how chatty Graziano is, and Bassanio attempts to explain it to Antonio, saying, Graziano speaks an infinite deal of nothing, more than any man in all of Venice. His reasons are as 2 grains of wheat in 2 bushels of chaff. You shall seek all day ere you find them, and when you have them, they're not worth the search. The lesson here is, it is better to remain silent and be thought the fool than to speak and remove all doubt. I'm Dave Romeo, and thank you for watching this episode of Romeo on Shakespeare. Please join me next time when we will look at the life and death of a king. But I charge you, do not fear. What a madcap hath heaven lent us here.